Welcome to the Subconscious Photography Podcast, where art meets science, reality meets perception, all through the lens of a camera. Now, ready your lenses, open your minds, and let's delve into the fascinating world of subconscious photography. Is this thing on?
Okay, is this thing on? Okay, is this thing on?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Subconscious Photography Podcast. I'm your host, David Senoff, and as I said, this is our fourth episode, but really our second full episode. As you know, we had our first episode was more like a teaser. Our second episode was a teaser and a preview because it was a little bit longer. And our third episode was really our first substantive episode. And it featured our first interview with my friend and former neighbor, filmmaker, cinematographer, and sometimes photographer, but all around storyteller, Scott Whitham. Today's episode features the second part of my interview with Scott. And if you've yet to listen to the first episode, I encourage you to do so. Together, these two episodes constitute a freewheeling exchange of ideas regarding photography, cinematography, sound, music, philosophy, artificial intelligence, forgery, and human perception, all from the point of view of both an attorney and a cinematographer. So for those of you who haven't yet listened to the first episode, and for those of you who have, let me take a moment to set the scene about what was going on at the end of that episode. Scott and I were having a discussion about forgery versus copying. And what I mean by that is sometimes you can have a forgery that's a copy. Think of somebody painting the Mona Lisa. That's a copy and a forgery. But sometimes you can have a forgery without having a copy. And that's what we were talking about. We were talking about the case of The Lost Vermeer, which is an excellent film I encourage everyone to see or read the book. In addition, we were talking about the forger, the protagonist in that story, Han van Meegeren, who was a forger of Dutch art in World War II, and he forged what he tried to pass off to Nazis, high-ranking Nazis, and did successfully actually pass them off as Vermeers. And they were not copies of Vermeers. In other words, he wasn't painting the girl with the pearl earring over and over again. Instead, what he did was, being an artist and a student of art history himself, he read as much as he could about Vermeer and realized that the experts believed that because there were so few Vermeers in circulation and because there were no Vermeers that had to do with the topic of religious subject matter, that Vermeer must have more paintings that have just yet to be discovered. And as a result, they thought that the Vermeers that were yet to be discovered had religious subject matters depicted in them. Now, that was just pure speculation pre-World War II and during World War II. But what Van Meegeren did was he forged paintings of religious scenes that he said were painted by Vermeer, but were not actually painted by Vermeer. They were forgeries, but they weren't copies. And the art world ate them up. The experts said, you see, we were right. Vermeer did have a religious phase, and this is proof of it. And obviously, all these paintings are really Vermeer. Of course, they weren't. And that led me to the question where I sort of tried to leave it as a cliffhanger, where I got the question and didn't let him answer. But the question was, given that you can have a forgery that is done by a professional artist, where the artist is versed in the style of the artist that he's forging, in this case, Vermeer, and then creates out of whole cloth paintings that never existed or even existed in the mind's eye of the artist, whether that is truly forgery. And if it is forgery, my question to him was, how is it that that is any different than an AI-generated picture where the AI model has been trained on one or more people's works? In other words, just like Van Meegeren who was able to copy Vermeer because he had studied him so closely. How is Van different than AI generating the great lost works of Scott's mom as a photographer, for example, or Alfred Stieglitz, or Da Vinci, or even Vermeer for that matter? AI doesn't have to copy, just like Van Meegeren didn't have to copy to be considered a forger. The forgery was the fact that he created a whole new painting, a whole new image, and said that it was painted by Vermeer when it wasn't. And isn't that what AI is truly doing? When you prompt it, it's simply relying on its training to create an image that is in the, quote, style of Vermeer, or in the, quote, style of Scott's mom as a photographer. So I thought I knew what Scott's response to this would be, but I was actually surprised at his answer. It very much surprised me. And for continuity's sake, I will play the question again when we start up the second part of the interview so that you can hear the question and the answer all at once. But I will tell you that Scott's answer truly surprised me, and it led to some very interesting conversation after that. So please join me in welcoming Scott Whitham, storyteller, back for the second and final part of our interview. Thank you. So my question is, how is that any different than AI generated pictures? And particularly in what you were talking about, like it's been fed all your mom's pictures, right? Isn't it just copying or forging?
I think it's,
painting in the style of.
I think it's, okay, maybe this is semantics, but interpretation. It's an interpretation. And again, I go back to, all things that we see act as inspiration to the stories we want to tell. Again, however we want to tell those stories, verbally, written, picture, painting, however, but it's as interpreted by you and how you choose to show it in the end. And so I think that if we want to not disparage AI, let's say, just like, the curator of the MoMA or whoever it was disparaged photography so many years ago, right? And embrace it. You say, it still has to have the inspiration to do it. Okay. And then once it has the inspiration, then it is free to interpret however it wants. And maybe that's the thing about AI that I think scares us. It's not so much that it's going to take your job, but it's that it will be free to do what it wants.
Well,
and I don't want to get into the whole James Cameron,
I was going to say,
thing of, Skynet and all that stuff, because I don't believe in that stuff,
The Wachowskis.
Or the witch. That's right. Just take the blue pill, by the way, because I know that steak is real. But fine. Let's since we're kind of going back and forth between movies, photography, and everything else, let's channel the Wachowskis for a minute and talk about that whole thing of the Matrix and what you believe is real, what isn't real, right? I mean, if you follow movie logic, okay, you're a slave to the non-reality, right? I mean, technically, you're a slave. That's how they portray it, because that's the point of view that the filmmakers want you to know, how they feel, that, you're a slave.
But is that an allegory? Well, because some people might say we're slaves now to the platforms.
Right. And they would not be wrong. I mean, look, We have little technical reminders of how slavish we are to our technologies when our phone says, your viewership's been up 13% from last week on your different online apps. I mean, talk about, like getting a little poke on the shoulder, right? That says, hey, by the way, look at what you're addicted to, and yet, how much credence do we pay that? But to kind of pull it back just a little bit, I feel that we can look at these technologies and say, okay, this is the beginning of the end, or this is going to take something away from X or Y. And there's a certain probably truth to that for some people. Some people, look, I remember reading a book about a cholera outbreak in London back in the 1850s. It was, I think, probably the single worst cholera outbreak in the history of the country. But that wasn't what was remarkable about the book, even though it was a great book. And I wish I could remember the name of it because it is a really good book. But what was astounding about the book was that the author spent the first 10 pages, let's say, just describing what life was like in Victorian England, specifically all of the different industries, all of the different jobs that people had, all of these things that have vanished. And we're talking about entire industries, people who probably made themselves in today's world like the Steve Jobs of their time, or, the richest person in the world. Like, people became very wealthy off these things, and they employed untold thousands of people. They're all gone. Those industries don't exist anymore. Those businesses don't exist anymore. Those jobs are gone. And you know what? People moved on. They pivoted. They figured something else out. Another thing came along and we adapted.
I agree, but I still think the question of does anybody care whether it's real is the most frightening thing for people. And, I read an article somewhere that said 15 to 20% of all artwork hanging in museums is likely forged, because the art world does an awful job of policing themselves, and because it's impossible to document the provenance of every painting known to mankind. And yet they stay up. Mm-hmm. Here in Philadelphia, there's a Vermeer that they kept in the basement for years. And finally, somebody, and everybody agreed initially that it was a total forgery. And then somebody came over from the Netherlands and said, no, I actually think this is real. And so the art museum is putting together an exhibition for the public to come in and judge for themselves.
One painting?
Well, they have a few Vermeers, and they're going to put them all together and ask which one is real and which one is not real. Mm-hmm. But in the end, because all art is subjective when viewed by somebody not the creator, mm-hmm. I bet 2/3 of the people will pick a real Vermeer as the fake because they just don't like that painting, right? So they don't like it, so that must be the forgery. Like, which one of these things doesn't belong?
Right.
But if no one really cares, and nobody told you that within this group of 4 paintings, one of them is a fake, you would walk right by it, look at it, and go, oh, that's nice, but it's not my favorite one. Because even Vermeer probably had a bad day. So I think that's the question. When you talk about ego and human consciousness and the interplay between the subconscious and your ego, that, I think, your question, does it matter, is really nerve-wracking for a lot of people.
Well, I will tell you this. I think that a lot of times we think something is important because we're told it's important. But what we don't often ask is, why? I mean, somebody might explain to us from their point of view, why they think this is important, why this particular Vermeer work is important. But strip that away and just allow a unfiltered, or you'll appreciate this being a lawyer, like sequestering juries, right? Same thing. Keep them away from the noise. Don't let them be unduly influenced by anything so that it colors their understanding of the facts of the case is being presented, right? If you were to sequester people from the influence of other people's opinions about things, what would they say about anything? To me, number one, I think that is, as a question, is something that I don't know if it can necessarily be answered, but more specifically, and this is my blunt feeling about all of the technological advances, things like AI, are embracing and accepting of them, or are fear and denial of whatever it is that we think they may or may not do. I think that the answer was answered way back at the beginning of this conversation. And you said it inadvertently. You said, we're both old now. And I think that with age comes a certain kind of fear. I think there's a fear of relevance or irrelevance. And I think the only way out and the only way for these things to rise to their own level of prominence or their own ineffectiveness is that we die. Because when we die, no one will know what it took to spool a bunch of 120 film, right? Because no one's doing that anymore. And in the same way that there will be a time, like I was talking about earlier in that book about the cholera plague and all of these industries and all these jobs that don't exist anymore that I had never even heard of. AI will just be whatever it is without all of the prejudgment, because no one will have ever known a time without it. And whatever it is in that moment, which whether it's seen as the boogeyman or as a technological savior, it'll be irrelevant, because this conversation that we're having now will never happen in the minds of those people, because they're not dead. And they're
okay. That's true. They're not dead.
Well, here, I'll give you. I'm gonna give you some context in this, because I had this conversation with a guy who I used to work with, who he was like a savant. Okay, like you would meet this guy, and just on looks alone, like a lot of people did with him, would completely misjudge him. He was slovenly. He was not well spoken. He never brushed his teeth. He dressed like a slob. He was so naturally, people would assume he's not an intelligent human being, but he was an incredibly smart guy. And we would have conversations. And I remember one time we were having a conversation. I don't remember what precipitated this exact conversation, but it was something about politics, something that was happening at the time. And I believe it was like, I'm going back now to when people like Cheney and Rumsfeld were, in the federal government. So we know when that was. That was a while back. And it was
I wish for that time.
Yes, a much simpler time when we knew who everybody was. And anyway, he said to me, it was some decision that they had made, which, we both politically disagreed with and thought it was a bad idea, and how it was going to sort of affect future generations. And he looked at me and he said, "My father calls those dead man decisions." And I go, "What the hell does that mean?" And he goes, "These are old men making decisions that know that they will not be around for the fallout of these decisions. They will not be accountable. They will not have to live in the world of consequence that their decisions created for the next generation.
That's what I call like the average Brexit voter.
Yeah, except they are living in that moment now. That's the only difference. They
Sadly, they thought it would take longer than it.
Oh man, yeah.
Yes, they are. Sadly,
P.T. Barnum, he had it right. There is a sucker born every minute. But my point in bringing that story into this, broad ranging conversation that we're having is that I just think that a lot of times our ego gets in the way and our fear takes over when we see something that we can't possibly imagine the bottom of. And I think with AI, we certainly can't see the bottom of it because it is so new. And I think that, obviously, and again, I don't want to channel too much of the Wachowskis and James Cameron in this.
I know this state is not real.
Okay.
But does it matter?
But does it matter? And so, like I said, that I feel like that question won't even be a question when we're dead, because it will have always been in somebody's life. Just like, I can't get my daughter to understand what a rotary phone is or what the words fast forward and rewind even mean, because those don't exist in her world.
I mean, come on, she can fast forward to the video. For you to
search, you search, but that button doesn't say fast forward. I mean, what the button doesn't say FF, and the other button does
the same symbols.
It has the same symbols, but that to them, they don't say I'm going to fast forward this.
But they know that a triangle sitting on its side means play, and a square means stop, and two horizontal lines means pause.
Yes, in the same way that when a squirrel sees an oncoming truck, sometimes it stops and sometimes it doesn't. But it's like even the blind squirrel gets a nut every once in a while. I don't even know what any of that just meant. But anyway, my point is I feel like the big discussion about AI will not be a big discussion 20 years from now, because what AI is going to be is a platform to another technology that won't be called AI. It's going to be called something else, because remember the internet superhighway?
Yeah, it's always jammed now, like the 405 on the West Coast.
Yeah. But that's a term that has gone the way of the dodo, right? Nobody calls it the internet superhighway anymore. It's like, it's just the internet, or the World Wide Web. Who even knows what www means on the front end of a URL, right? If you're of a certain age, no one, right? And you don't even have to really type it in anymore.
No.
All you have to type in is whatever, search.com, that's it, or search.org.
You and I remember a time when the word Google was not both a noun and a verb.
That's right. That's true. But I really do think that AI and what it is now is not what it will be. And I think it's going to be something very different and I think it's going to be something less promising than what it is, because again, if we're going to use the internet as an example, everybody thought the internet was going to be the democratization of shared knowledge. And instead, what is it used for? Online shopping and porn, more than anything else.
And it's an echo chamber. Don't forget that.
Yes, right. Yeah, for bad ideas. So, and really, if you transfer that onto AI, it's going to be more of the same.
Well, and actually, you're not far off, because I did see that they are thinking about training AIs with different political biases, cultural biases, both good and bad, however you judge that to be good or bad. And that eventually people will use ChatGPT if they believe a certain set of things, and something else if they believe a different set of things.
Yeah. The politicization of chat robots. That's a scary thing to contemplate, but we're kind of already there, really. If you think about it, we're really already there. Because the platforms already exist. And, I think this next election cycle is going to be interesting as hell in terms of all of the, bad faith actors, I'll say, for lack of a better description, that are going to stick their nose into the political race here in this country. And not just here. I mean, there's something like there's like somewhere between 50 and 75 major Democratic elections happening all around the world this year. Like the future of democracy is literally hanging in the balance.
But, so that's an interesting question. And without falling down the rabbit hole of politics, which I would do gladly, I'll just ask you this, though. Does it matter? Do the outcomes matter? I mean, when Plato wrote the allegory of the cave, where people were chained up in a cave and all they saw was two-dimensional shadows on the wall, and then when they get out into the world, they realize, oh my God, this is great. They come back, they try and free their friends. And their friends are like, get the hell out of here. What are you talking about? There's nothing out there. Yeah. Nothing different than this. And in the same way, when he wrote that, there were various empires. The Babylonian Empire rose and fell. Alexander the Great came and went. Rome, England, France, the Germans in their various iterations. And yet here we are.
Right.
So does it matter? Because I wonder whether all this anxiety is not so much because people are afraid that people with opposing views will come to power. I think people are just afraid that the entire system will change, and that's what matters to them. It's the same fear as AI.
Boy, there's a lot to unpack in that. I mean, this is what I will say to join you partway down the rabbit hole. And that is that I think what we are in the midst of now, which, as you very well pointed out, I mean, we've been here before. I mean, I remember I read, I can't remember if it was a John Meacham novel. I think it was a John Meacham novel that he wrote a few years ago, where basically he just took different political flashpoints throughout the history of our country, United States, and pointed to extremely specific examples that were eerily similar to things that are going on right now. And his whole point, the whole exercise was, we've been here before. We've seen this before. We've witnessed this before. We've lived this before. And we've survived. Simple as that. So, yeah, are we living in a moment in time? Yes. The thing that I think, though, when I look at what it is, though, that makes us have this inability to, talking about history, what's past is prologue, right? We were talking about that earlier. What consistently humans get wrong about being able to revisit history or look back, or this refusal to look back over your shoulder to go, oh, wait, shit. Yeah, we did this before and this came out badly. That inability to just, what the lemmings going off the edge of the cliff, right? Is, I get back to it's our mortality. that makes us so screwed up. And what's tied in with that is our fear of change, because our fear of change is directly tied to our mortality.
You mean because change is marking the closer you're getting to the end of your life?
100%. And I'm sure, I'm assuming you probably think about that, because I know I think about that, because I'm not even, I mean, you used to say, I'm on the older side of young. And it's like, no, I mean, like, yeah, because like,
you getting email from AARP, just like
I've been getting it for a while now. And yeah, I think that change is indicative of our mortality. And I think that is why people rail against change and the things that they don't understand, and they refuse to understand. Like, their ignorance becomes a cudgel because they want to beat back the change, because it is their way of having to ignore the fact that you are going to be dust one day.
So you don't want to make America great again because you think it's still great. I'll join you there again. Since we're talking about it, people talk about America, the great experiment, right? Okay. I may sound naive and optimistic when I say it, but I do still believe in it. And I do still believe that the very things that this country was founded upon that made it part of that great experiment, the people escaping religious intolerance in other countries, for example. Well, a lot of people don't seem to realize that a lot of the reasons why people came here was for exactly that reason. And yet we can't be intolerant of others. It's like the whole immigrant experience, right? And it's like, we are a country made of immigrants, and yet we are so fearful of immigrants because they're going to take something from us. And what is that thing that they are going to take from us? Our jobs.
Right. And they're going to take our jobs because, first of all, if you become complacent in your place in the world, that's your fault. If you've become irrelevant, that is your fault. If these people are able to replace your relevancy, that is your fault. That is not their fault. And that is not a reason to fear them. It should be a reason to get up off your ass and make yourself relevant. It's like the old Steve Martin phrase, right? Be so damn good that they can't ignore you. It's like, where the hell is that? It's
except that, to bring this full circle, when the rise of the machines happens, whenever that day may be, they're going to take better pictures than me for sure. And no matter how much I practice, I'll never beat that.
And again, you have to understand what your idea of is the best damn picture is not going to be what the best damn picture is going to be 100 years from now. Because if we completely allow machines to rewire what we perceive as art, as a spontaneous, authentic moment, then it truly is limitless, because they can show us things that we've never imagined, because they're not held down by the constraints that we are held down by, which is the age-old idea of smart people are full of doubt, stupid people are full of confidence.
Listen, if a fool and his money are able to get together in the first place, right? I mean, but I do think, you're right in the sense that we are living in a moment of change and yet still hear the same rhetoric from the past, right? Just like real artists look down on photographers and real photographers look down on digital photography, and then digital photographers look down on cellular photographers. Is that even a thing? Is that a thing? Like an iPhone photographer. And yet all that produced was 1.8 trillion photos a year. I mean, I don't know how we're going to store all this crap.
Well, it's just going to take a big, electromagnetic pulse, and then it's all poof, it's gone. All those memories.
Negatives.
I know. Well, believe me. And I say to my fellow filmmaker friends all the time. I go, think about it. I said, everything we have worked on in the last 15 to 20 years, one big electromagnetic pulse, and there will be not a single record of any of it. It'll all be gone. It'll all be binary dust, and it is kind of crazy to think about that, right? Because and that gets me back to, like, you're talking about, like, film, and it also makes me think about, like, records too, musical records, right? Like, I hate records. I'm not into them at all. I'm not into the collecting of them. I was, obviously, when that was all that was available, but there is something about analog, we'll call it, analog technologies, that they can withstand the test of time better.
And also, I think they sound warmer, but that's another taste.
I can give you the whole technical breakdown of why albums sound different, by the way.
Actually get that from a digital recording amplified through an analog amplifier. So I don't know how much of it has to do with the recording and how much of it has to do with the playback.
Yeah, there's a whole technical description of why albums sound different from more modern, forms of music playback, like MP4s and CDs and all that other stuff. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, but it's like people think they're hearing a more pure form of the music, and that's absolutely not true. They're hearing a dumbed down version of the actual high fidelity of that original recording, because you cannot reproduce the true low end bass frequencies of the original music on an LP, because the grooves that are cut into the record, the needle will jump off the record when it hits that, because the frequencies are based on vibrations, grooves dug into the record. So when people say that's what it really sounds like, nah, it's not. You just hear the air go out of that balloon for all those people who collect LPs.
I did hear that, which is okay for me. I don't even know from where my music collection originates anymore, because originally, like, I had some records which I then recorded onto cassette tapes, then
replaced with CDs,
then ripped them off of CDs into MP3. And now I'm not even sure I own any of my music. I think I just rent it.
What you're talking about, which is something I have actually given a lot of thought about, is tactileness.
Yes.
And, I think that all technology, especially as it continues to exponentially speed up, we will, and actually already have, lost a lot of our ability for what I'll call just tactile pleasure, and I don't mean that in necessarily just a sexual way, but I mean, look, and again, there are people who will never appreciate or understand this, because when eventually LPs die out again, because they will eventually, no one will ever understand the pleasure of holding an album in their hand and reading the liner notes, right? Okay. Simple, dumb thing, right? But like, that'll be gone. Like the rag and bone man of Victorian England. Okay. You can remember who that was, but that was an entire industry. So yes, I think that tactileness is going to be something, I would say, if anything scares me more than anything else about technology and the rapidness with which it is able to proliferate and create more experiences, is that those experiences will move us further away from the tactile aspect of what makes those things enjoyable. And we won't understand why there's this empty hole in the middle of our frickin' soul, because all of that has been drained away from us like jelly out of a donut.
Well, look, I mean, I'm sitting here with, I don't know, 200-300 pens around me, and I can't find a blank piece of paper to write on. And then somewhere in this room, I have an e-reader and writer, which is very tactile, will read my handwriting, will convert it to typewritten text. But because we're living in this transitional era, this device will, sells thousands of units a year, because everybody who's alive today somehow, some way, somewhere learned how to use a pen and paper.
Right.
But when they don't have to do that anymore, you'll lose the entire tactile sensation of writing, of the friction of the pen against paper, or the friction of a fake pen against a fake screen, which, by the way, they made kind of rough
on purpose
to simulate pushing the pen across a piece of paper. But I chalk that up to the period of transition. But then I guess the question really is there any era or period that could be considered not transitional?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that, we have to constantly evolve. I mean, it's, thank God, I believe that there are more curious human beings in this world than non-curious human beings. Now, does that curiosity have an ability to make an impact on our world? Probably not. I mean, yes, obviously great ideas, or ideas that make money or can be mass marketed, push their way to the top. But there's a lot of imaginative thinking going on out there that probably never sees the light of day. But I think that imagination is what grows us and what continues to evolve us. And I don't believe I envision a version of our future like the movie WALL-E. Where we're all these floating gelatinous bags with no bone mass left because everything's done for us. And so we have no muscle tone or anything. And we're literally like larvae, like human larvae,
Okay.
But I because I think that, if you believe in this notion that in our DNA is all the DNA of every human being that somehow walked this planet, we carry in us, like, for example, the whole flight or fight thing, right? Like, that's instinctive, and it goes back to the time when, we were being eaten by saber-toothed tigers, right? Or the guy next door in the cave who wanted, your food because he didn't have it, so he was going to kill you for it. I think that stuff will always be resident within us, and so what that carries along with is a whole, knowledge of humanity. And I think, with humanity, look at how much happier people are when they're outside. Okay.
By the way.
On the beach. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when you were a kid, you probably were.
Yeah.
But I just feel like, we're always going to be, it's no different than like talking about our kids, right? And you're going, oh my God, what are they going to do when they're adults, right? Like how are they going to survive? How are they going to live? Like, my daughter can't even tie her shoes. She can't even sign her name. Speaking of writing, by the way, because they didn't teach cursive writing. So she does not know how to sign her name. She can write.
In the future,
But-
we will all trade goods and services biometrically.
Probably not too far off the map on that one. But I think, every generation has looked at the previous generation or the future generation and said, oh my God, we're doomed. Right. Okay. Just like, talking about, history and looking at all of the different rings on the trees of history and saying, well, look at the shit show that happened here versus what happened there and everything. And yet we're still here, and even, talking about, people using nuclear weapons. It's like, what does that even mean? It's that is pulling a string on a sweater.
I think it's more than lighting a sweater on fire.
Yeah.
But
I mean, my point is like, once you start pulling, it's it, man. You're not going to stop pulling until that sweater is completely unraveled. You can't stop. You can't,
there is a reason we only ever drop 2 in the history of the world.
Yes, exactly. Because, and when you hear somebody like Vladimir Putin, who yesterday says, oh, well, if NATO, sends troops over to Ukraine and that's a nuclear provocation, it's like, oh, sure. Okay. Thanks, Vlad.
Well, he'll end up, and I know he won't have a problem with it, but he'll end up murdering a large number of Russians.
Yes, exactly.
If you do that.
Exactly. So it's a lot of it is just junk talk, right? It's politicians posturing and doing because that's what they do, right? But again, also that is a dead man talking because he knows that his policies and his point of view will die with him, but the world will go on to live in the shadow of the bullshit that he rained down upon people. And that's why he doesn't care.
Even Stalin died.
Yeah.
You would think he could take a lesson from that.
That's right.
Even if they don't have death and taxes in Russia, they certainly had death. So,
according to what's his name, the idiot from Fox News, guy got fired.
Tucker Carlson.
Tucker Carlson, right? They live better lives than we do.
Look at how beautiful this subway station is.
Right. Look, you put a ruble in to get your carriage, but when you return the carriage, you get the ruble back.
Mm-hmm.
That's like saying to an American, give me a penny. You're going to be like, I don't want the penny back.
Right, because
nobody wants a penny.
It's too heavy in my pocket.
That's right. A ruble isn't worth anything. Their economy sucks.
So let me
digress.
Because before I let you go, I want you to talk about the documentary that you produced and has been out, and talk a little bit about that, but also and the process it took to make that. And then tell me whether you think AI could make that. Go.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for allowing me to do a shameless plug of my film. It's called, write this down, listeners. Okay, Burden of Memory. And you can view the trailer for the film on burdenofmemorymovie.com. That's burdenofmemorymovie.com. And you can find out information about the film as far as like any screenings that we're going to have, any upcoming screenings. We'll list information on there about that. And
can we find out how many awards you've already won?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
But people are probably saying, okay, Burden of Memory, what is it? So it's a story
like The Matrix. That is
it is. Well, it's I will tell you this. So the synopsis of the story, basic synopsis, short, the elevator pitch of the story is I had the rare and fortunate opportunity to meet a World War II veteran who had the unbelievable, you could call it luck, you could call it misfortune or whatever, but he happened to be both at Pearl Harbor, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, had very vivid memories of that, but also managed after Pearl Harbor to parlay his skills as an airplane mechanic to get into flight school, and then became a squadron leader in the 15th Air Force in Italy, and flew B-17 bombing missions out of Italy, flew 30 combat missions, which again, I think like just made him in and of himself a very rare bird, because very few people participated in both theaters of the war, both in the Pacific and in Europe. So that in and of itself made him a very, very unique character, of which there were very few. But he also, I mean, he went on to have a remarkable life after the war. He stayed in the military. He did not muster out like a lot of guys did. He stayed in the military. And he actually, he flew basically what was considered a last ditch suicide mission during the Cold War, where if say all the B-52s, all the ICBMs had been destroyed by the Russians. Okay. All of the B-52s with strategic nuclear warheads had been shot out of the sky by the Russians. He and a bunch of other pilots that were stationed all throughout Western Europe were the last ditch effort. And they were basically what they were kamikaze pilots. So these guys were on constant alert 24/7. They flew a jet with a single thermonuclear warhead strapped to the bottom of it, and they would do a low altitude drop on a pre-designated target, knowing that they would never be able to pull that jet up and away from the blast radius in time. And these guys did this willingly. And he told me, with all the missions he flew in Germany during Second World War, and he flew a lot of them in some really heavy areas with serious flak and German fighter pilot support and everything else. He said he was never as terrified in the entirety of the Second World War as he was. And he never, of course, obviously flew a real thermonuclear drop, but those guys lived in a constant state of preparedness, because they never knew if the drills, because what they would do if they were on duty, they'd have to sleep at the end of the runway and be able to get into their plane in and off the ground in under a minute, because that's how little time they would have had if there was a real nuclear attack happening before they would have been taken out, because the Russians knew where they were. The Russians knew where these pilots were located. And he said he saw, the alarm would go off and you'd have to get up and from a dead sleep, run to your cockpit, fire up the engine, blast to the end of the runway. And he saw quite a few guys die because they couldn't get the plane up and they crashed on the end of the runway. And he watched one of his friends burn alive in the cockpit, couldn't get him out. But the film itself really only focuses on certain parts of his life. Because I could have made a 4-hour film about this guy. And I spent 8 years talking to him, interviewing him, following through his last final years of his life. And then, by the way, he only passed away just about 2 years ago. He made it to 100, just barely, but he made it to 100. But I really decided to focus on his choices, for his career in the military, really his Second World War stories, because I felt like that probably would have the greatest amount of interest to most people, because that's something that a lot of people, I think, can collectively wrap their head around. They have a basic understanding of what World War II is. I felt that taking his career to the outer edges of the Cold War and all that stuff just was, some people might, it's just not as relevant to a lot of people, unfortunately, as World War II is, because it's been lionized in countless movies, right? So people basically, if it's World War II, they're going to listen up. But the film was not about his exploits as a pilot. It was about, if you can ever really reconcile yourself with your past. And I think that the thing that interested me about him, and what interests me about most people as they age out in this world, is that your life becomes a series of points of reconciliation. And it's either reconciling yourself with the things that you did or the things that you didn't do, the things you would have done differently. And as memory serves us, and which is why I kind of thought of the title of Burden of Memory. And actually that occurred to me early on in the filming of this. It did not take me long. I watched how, he was burdened by a lot of his memories, and he had buried them for years. He did not talk about his experiences in the war for many years. And most of those men and women who came back from the war didn't. And interestingly, and I found this out because I did interview some other veterans as part of the film, even though it really focuses on this one guy who, by the way, his name is Lieutenant Colonel William Benelli. I didn't even mention his name. That most of them didn't talk about the war because, first of all, they just wanted to be past it. But even more so, and this was interesting, I found out that they just figured that every other guy had been through the same thing that they had been through. So what did they have to talk about? Because most of them they wanted to push it away. And it wasn't until they got older and I would talk to these guys and they would say that, they're starting to wake up in the middle of the night with memories that they hadn't had in 50 years, of being on a mission that they hadn't thought about in 50 years. And that happens to a lot of these veterans as they started to age out. And then suddenly they felt the need to talk about it. And that's basically what happened to this guy, Bill Benelli, is that he just decided he needed to get this stuff out in the open about what he did, because it's part of history.
So now answer the second part of my question. Can AI make an award-winning documentary about a World War II pilot who served in both theaters and titled it Burden of Memory without the assistance of humans?
So here's what I want to say about that, because I have done a lot of thinking about that, because I've thought about not so much about whether AI could have made the film that I and others worked on, but could AI create a real human story about something that never happened? Because if you think about it, that's what if you think about documentary films, right? Which is what I mostly do. Most documentary films are about real things that happened, usually being told firsthand from the people who experience them, right? So my question about AI then is, how can it create something without having that input of that real person's experience? Because what AI would have to do, it would have to take whatever information you give it and extrapolate it, and then also fill in the blanks. Here's the other thing. It would have to make choices, because remember, way back at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about, creativity is all about choices, about what you choose to say, how you choose to say it, where you choose to point the camera or you don't, what you exclude, what you include, is in the breadth of his story. Just like I made that decision not to put anything about his family in there, not to put anything about his exploits during the Cold War, not to put anything in there about his time in the FAA, which he was also in for 30 years before he retired. I made that decision to exclude that. Would AI be able to make that same kind of decision? Or would it just say, spew everything out and say, you pick for yourself? Like, would it make it a smorgasbord?
Well, you tell me, because this is my point.
But that's what I'm saying is, I don't think it can. I don't think it can, because I don't believe that AI, at least in its current form, has the ability to make those distinctions and those choices.
No, but what it does do, and what it does do pretty well, is two things. One, it will predict what the most likely next fill in the blank would be. So if you gave it the first 3 scenes of your documentary, it would give you what it believed was likely the fourth scene.
See, I would love to do that as an experiment, and I'll tell you why. Because I know I told you I edited this film for many years, and the thing with editing films is you could do it forever. And partially just because it's never the way you want it. You can always find ways to make it better, but also because I had so much footage. I had years of footage. I had hours and hours and hours sitting with this man, asking him all kinds of questions, filmed him in so many different events and, air shows and whatever, what have you, speeches that he gave. And I just, in the end, I didn't focus on telling a linear story. I didn't go where logic dictated. I kind of gave myself in to the moments and said, I purposely said, I'm not going to impose certain types of film language onto this. And I've had a lot of people who've watched it say that to me. They're going, what I enjoyed about that film is that, it's really like just a bunch of random moments thrown together, which is what you could say about any film. Really that's what they are, but they're told artfully or linearly or whatever. But I didn't necessarily follow any kind of dictate like that. Like I found the best moment that I could find with him telling a story. And then I told that. And then I just said, where is this telling me to go next? I let it tell me where to go.
And when you say that, you don't just mean linearly in the cinematic way. You mean it also, you didn't necessarily put it together chronologically.
Correct. And in fact, the film jumps back and forth in time. That was a conscious effort, because I wanted to also show how quickly he changed in a very short period of time, like him aging and seeing him like at 99 and going, wow, he looks 99. And then seeing him, then jumping back to him telling a story from 4 years ago, and he's a completely different human being. He's like fire in his eyes and, telling the story with a great deal of passion, like he's living it in that moment. And he had that ability. That was his great gift as a storyteller, was to put you in a moment. He was very, very, very good at that. And a lot of people cannot do that. And he did it well. But I think, the thing that fascinated me about him beyond just his exploits in the war, like I dove into this idea of doing the story with him because, of course, I'm a history buff, and, World War II fascinates me. All conflict fascinates me, but that's not what held me. What held me was, and I knew that I was not going to be able to finish this film until he died, because I wanted to follow him to the very end, literally up until the moment he died, because I wanted to see if things changed for him as he started to touch his end of his life, and if his stories changed, and if the way he felt about certain things he had said or done had changed. And as you said, memory is an incredibly
bad memory.
It's a tricky thing, and he says it right up front at the beginning of the movie. He said, this is a story about the truth as I see it. These are my memories. And I put that in there right up front because I wanted people to understand. It's like, it may not be the absolute truth, but this is what he has firmly set into his head, what he believes to be the truth.
So then let me ask you this. If he could have talked that truth into Sora, and Sora could have spat out some footage, B-roll footage, right? Like he's remembering a particular bombing run over Berlin or wherever, and Sora could render it, would you use it?
If it made sense, yes, I would. And it's funny. I've thought about that, actually, believe it or not, because there were definitely moments where he talked about certain things. And I tried so hard to close my eyes and imagine what that would look like. And yet here's the thing too, though, is I ultimately feel like that kind of thing actually does a disservice, because I feel like that is, again, going back to the idea of you don't have to show the audience everything and you don't have to tell them anything. I mean, there's a great big question mark at the end of the film. There's no resolution with this film. And it's because it's, that's we come in and out. It's like people say, I don't want to die alone. Well, you die alone. Okay. Simple as that.
Are there going to be 1,000 subreddits explaining the end of this movie to me somewhere?
Yes. And what the monolith actually was
Dave, open the door. I'm sorry. How?
Yeah. I just think, what it was? It was, in the end, he just was like, he wanted to tell his story, but he just didn't. He wanted to be relevant, I think we all go out. It's like I said before, it's like, it's the idea of knowing our mortality and that fear. We were talking earlier about, why do people fear change? Because it signals their mortality, and I think that he was the same way. Like, well, what I did, will it matter? Will anyone care? Was I a good man? Was I a bad man? Did I, how many people did I kill? I have no idea. I was flying 30,000 feet in the air, and they're
with dumb munitions, not laser guided.
Yeah, really. I mean,
pinpoint accurate.
A guy would walk on a wooden plank between bomb compartment, and the bomb compartment was open at this point. So all you were walking on was a 1 foot wide plank, and he walked and pulled the pins out of the bombs to arm them before they dropped them. I mean, that's World War II in a nutshell. I mean, it was the craziest war, because we came into that war with biplanes and horses, right. And we left it with jets and nuclear destruction, in 7 short years.
Well, it's funny, because I was gonna ask you, us being the geezers that we are, that in our lifetime we went from watching black and white television, ballpoint pens being a luxury item, no portable FM radio. But then I think this guy was born 50 years before that, and survived to see cell phones and texting.
Yeah. And, interestingly, he embraced it all. That was what I found interesting about him. He was always interested. And I think that was the mechanic in him. That was the engineer in him, because he, like I said, before he was a pilot, he was a mechanic on B-17s and B-25s and B-26s. And he was always interested in how stuff worked. And, and this was also just an odd aside with him, but he was also financially incredibly astute. Like he was like always looking at his bank statements. Always up at the table, like looking at his bank statements, poring over them and going, I'm calling this bank. They're robbing me. But he kept track of that stuff, and he made money for friends of his too. He was an interesting human being. I mean, and we're not minting as many of them as we used to. And I'll tell you one last little bit from the film, which I think sort of solidifies not just that generation, because, we hear people like Tom Brokaw say, the greatest generation, whatever. But when I had the opportunity, as I told you before we started recording this, that I got to interview Norman Lear as part of this film. And I asked him a question about the world in which we lived in today. And I said, why was there such a fervent call to arms by the entire country, the United States, when the war came out? And why does that not exist today? Why does nobody want to get involved in anything? Why is the military looked down upon? Why is there all this kind of like, why is there all this fear and ignorance? And he had an answer for me right off the bat. He said, civics. When I was a kid, and I'm doing a bad impersonation of Norman Lear, by the way, but he said, when I was a kid, they taught civics. You know what they teach in civics? They teach you about our form of government and how it works. They teach you about the Constitution. So we knew what we were fighting for. We knew the way of life that we were going to protect, because people don't know what the hell they're fighting for anymore.
All right, I'm not going to follow you down that rabbit hole, but I mean, look, World War II was certainly a war where people knew what they were fighting for and knew.
It was arguably the last great noble war, where it felt like it was black and white, good and bad, fascism, democracy, all that stuff,
Right. I mean, and by the time we got into the war, the Germans were a half an inch away from England. And say what you will.
And they were taking over a lot of Soviet Russia at that point. Well, and the Japanese had taken over most of the South Pacific. We're headed towards Australia.
Well, listen, let's not relive the Philip K. Dick book, The Man in the High Tower, because that's a whole other episode. But honestly, if we hadn't gotten a war, I feel like the Germans might have successfully invaded England, and the Eastern Front might have stalemated, and then there would be them and us.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Being squeezed by both ends, in the West and in the East.
It's an interesting thing. An interesting thing to contemplate.
But the point I was going to make was, it's hard for people to add up or do the math of why we funded Saddam and then had to drive our military through Iraq twice, 3 times maybe, I don't know, and our way of life other than oil, which, by the way, no matter who was in power was going to sell it to us, because that's how they make their money. And World War II doesn't seem like that. It doesn't seem like a fight for our way of life because of some natural resource.
Right.
It really, like you say, was a fight between good and bad, black and white, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. I mean, you can really get into the whole nuts and bolts of World War II. Was really World War II was the refighting of World War I, because it never really ended, because it ended badly, and we punished the Germans and busted up Europe and all these different little bizarre bits and pieces and left them with a bad taste in their mouth. And there's definitely an element of truth to that. But I mean, you'd really have to go back, honestly, to, look at why any of that shit happened. You have to go back to like the times of the Visigoths, because, you had these Germanic tribes, who led to the eventual downfall of the Roman Empire, right? That marauded their way throughout Europe for centuries, and then eventually, when you had the unification of Germany, in the 1870s, that was basically just the solidification of a martial, of a warrior class. They had grown up with, people talk about the Middle East, for example, and they go, well, why? It's like, ever read the Bible? It's like, it was written a long time ago. And guess what? they hated each other then, you know? I mean, it's just, this stuff has just...
It's also an allegory.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Listen, don't cough your way out of this world on my, as the distinguished first guest on this podcast, which I forgot to mention earlier as well.
Which I'm honored, by the way. I'm honored so much I'm crying. I think that's the choking, though.
It could be. But I do think all of this is just, the thing for me is,
to bring it back,
the thing for me is that I take a lot of pictures of my flowers in the front garden. I mean, maybe not as much as your mom, but I take them on different format cameras, and I take them different times of the year, and I take them over the course of different years. And the same way I take pictures of my kids, right? Because it's marking time. And I don't foresee, and this may just be my own geezer bias, but I don't foresee AI as a tool taking over the production of 1.8 trillion snapshots a year. Because I do think, like you said, particularly with regard to photography and documentary filmmaking, it's a way to mark time. And it's also a way to preserve the past, right? Particularly when you think about photojournalism or real-time documentaries where people are embedded with the armies and stuff like that. Absent that, there's no visual record. And no matter how good AI is, to me, that's not the visual record. And that may just be my bias as a lawyer, as a photographer, because, for me, nothing ever happens unless in court it's on the record, or I have a picture of it, or whatever it is. But, I have rolls and rolls of film of my kids playing soccer. I mean, I was putting my negatives away, and I'm like, how many rolls of film did I take of my kids playing soccer? And it's a lot. But you know what? They're all different. And thank God it didn't use a digital camera, because it's only 36 pictures on a roll, not 36,000. But I don't foresee AI ever getting to the point where they take cameras out of cell phones, for example.
I wish I could say with any sense of certainty that is true, because, who could have imagined the iPhone, right? Before, when did it come out? 2005, 2007? I think it's it might have been somewhere around there, right? We can't imagine a world without it, but we also can barely remember the world before it.
Let me just say this about that. I remember when you got your first iPod, and how you were like, look at how much of my music it holds.
Yeah,
and,
right.
I need nothing.
And who gives a shit about an iPod anymore, right? That's what I mean. It's like, in fact, funny part about that, I just threw that iPod out like a month ago. And why, God only knows why I was even holding on to it, because the thing wouldn't even fire up anymore. But I guess I was just thinking maybe a museum will want this someday, or whatever. But because they wouldn't want any of the music on it, that's for sure. But I think I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit and try and dissect what you just said. And the word that comes to mind for me is witness.
Yeah, right. Or the Mad Men episode where Don Draper has to pitch Kodak, and he comes up with the
carousel.
The carousel.
Right. Because they had some very techie, like the slide tray or whatever it was. And he's like, or whatever, the picture holder. And he's like, and he does it in the pitch. He says, this is not a slide tray. This is a carousel that spins round and round with these beautiful memories and images that just keep circling around inside your mind that remind us of all these great moments, right? Something to that effect.
Right, because
better written by Matthew Weiner than me,
But Kodak had the memories of your life. Right. That was their slogan for a long time.
Right. As did Taster's Choice, but it was celebrate the moments of your life.
I don't know why. I mean,
how that translated to a coffee is, I guess that's just the genius of Madison Avenue.
But particularly that coffee, because nobody wants to celebrate with Taster's Choice.
No, but boy, it had a place in my parents' pantry for many years. And it was the first coffee I remember drinking. I drank Taster's Choice. It was a conscious choice. But yeah, I think witness to me is, we all want people to bear witness to what we've seen and done. And I think that, like the film that I was talking about earlier that I did, I felt like that was a necessary thing for people to see him bear witness to what his life had been for him and how he felt about it. And I think that every photograph, consciously or unconsciously, is exactly that.
Because you chose to point and to shoot.
And to have people bear witness to something, because in that moment, you saw something unique or important or special, whatever adjective you want to attach to it.
But then you, of course, are the one deciding what events you believe need to be witnessed.
Right.
And
that's creating your own narrative.
And I don't think AI, certainly I don't think it can do it now, but I'm not sure it will ever to be able to critically think to that level, as opposed to the level of grip and rip. And I mean that as pejoratively as possible, right? Where that you're going to get something, so you keep your finger on the shutter.
Yeah. Agreed. Like those sometimes conscious choices about, it was like the Noam Chomsky article that I read too, right? Like what distinguishes us from AI and those choices. And I think that, to know that, even a blind squirrel gets a nut every once in a while, right? Okay. But does AI even understand what that concept means? Do I keep pressing down on the shutter because I know that there's going to be something in this moment that's going to get my attention eventually? I'll just have to go back in my Lightroom later on and look at it all and pick out the right frame, right? Just like when I was telling you back at the beginning, it's like cinema verite, cinema of the moment. That's the kind of stuff that I prefer, because I prefer things to be unrehearsed, unchoreographed, because I feel like that's when you get the best stuff, is when you let people interpret it in their own way, give them the credit of being able to figure it out for themselves. Because if you did your job right, you're pointing your camera in the right direction already. You just have to let them figure out the rest.
But of course, once you point your camera at anything,
you've made a choice. And you've already edited it.
And you've edited it, but you've also influenced the people on the other side of the lens, particularly if they know that
the camera's pointing at them 100%. No, there's no doubt about that. It comes down to taste, I think too. It's like you have to have good taste, and good taste isn't about, champagne and caviar and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's pop culture bullshit. But I think that, taste is about knowing when and when not to do something. What, Kenny Rogers, right? Gambler. I can't believe I actually invoked Kenny Rogers either. The name of Kenny Rogers.
Know when to hold in the hand.
Know when to fold. Know when to walk away.
Know when to run.
No. And you never count your money. Okay, enough. Stop.
On that note, I'm just going to say, remind our listeners to check out burdenofmemory.com. I'll leave a link in the description.
Burden of Memory, movie.com.
I got it wrong. So Burden of Memory, the movie.com.
No, Burden of Memory movie. Burden of Memory movie.com.
It's been a long day and I'm old.
The sun is setting.
Burden of Memory movie.com, which is why I'm going to leave a link in the description. But I want to thank Scott Whitham for being our distinguished first guest. And I hope he'll come back for a wide-ranging discussion of whatever we didn't discuss today.
Which wasn't much left on that plate.
But that's all right. I feel like if we take some time and think about it, we could probably come up with some more stuff. And if we were drinking whiskey while we were thinking about it,
oh God,
we could probably come up with some even more stuff.
And I'll ask ChatGPT for some suggestions for next time.
And I'm sure ChatGPT will give you some brilliant response. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Well, as you just heard, Scott and I were nothing if not polite there at the end. We received a few comments and questions from some of our listeners wondering about the future of this show. In response, let me say this. It is my intention to create more episodes with more content from just me and with more interviews from as many interesting people like Scott as possible. It is also my intention to release this content more frequently and on a more regular basis. What would be really very helpful for me is if you, our listeners, could subscribe to the podcast, leave comments or questions, and also leave suggestions for guests you'd like to hear interviewed or topics you'd like to learn more about. Based solely on my interview with Scott, I hope you can discern the depth and breadth of the topics that interest me and the people I'd like to interview. But don't let that limit your suggestions. If you suggest an idea beyond my expertise, I promise you I'll research it so that I can speak on it competently and confidently, and then go out and find an expert in that field or on that particular topic so that we can interview that person. My true wish and mission for this show is first to broaden my own horizons, while at the same time broadening your horizons. Second, to give you the benefit of my knowledge and experience on these topics, the topics that I can actually speak competently about. And third, to create a community of people, just a community of people without any labels, who share these interests so that people from all backgrounds and all walks of life who share these common interests in perception, photography, philosophy, metaphysics, can get together and exchange their ideas with one another. The goal, my friends, is what Scott said: to inspire. In other words, to create a community of people who share the same interests, but at the same time are different enough so that we can all draw inspiration from one another. The day this podcast turns into an echo chamber will be the last episode of the show.
I want to thank you for tuning into the Subconscious Photography Podcast today. If our journey through the art and science of photography has captivated you, please subscribe to the podcast, share it with friends, and leave us a positive review. We're excited to continue this exploration with you, and you can visit us at www subconscious-photography.com for more episodes. You can take a look at some of my rotating and random favorite photographs that I've shot recently. And you can also email us your comments and experiences directly through the website. Your insights and support are invaluable to this community. Please listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, soon to be YouTube Podcasts, or whatever your preferred podcast provider may be. Again, I'm David Senoff, your host, and thank you for joining us.